Okay, just to pick back up on our videos for personality, we are going to end with the trait perspective on personality. We talked about this before in terms of, when we think about how people are, we tend to think of them in terms of the traits that make up their personality. And so traits are, these relatively stable, these enduring predispositions that we have to behave in a particular way. And, when we look at the psychoanalytic, the humanistic, and the social cognitive perspectives, what we find is that these are all focused on the similarities of people. The one thing that's different about the trait perspective is it actually focuses on the individual differences of people, not how similar we are, but how different we are. And so, of course, we see that trait theorists tend to focus on identifying, describing, and measuring those differences in behavioral dispositions or those personalities. And they look at these pieces, these complete little pieces of what makes up you as a unique person as traits. And so these attributes are considered traits. And so when we look at how we can test this, okay, we can say that they are inferred from observable behavior. If you say that somebody is, shy, you observe their behavior and see that they don't like to talk a lot to others. You see somebody is outgoing, they tend to sort of project themselves outward and talk to people and things like that. When we look at the English language, we have about 4,000 English words to describe personality traits, these descriptors, what we refer to as surface traits. Now, what we see in terms of surface traits versus other kinds of traits, so surface traits are these sort of, these attributes that we get from observable behavior, but source traits are the most fundamental dimension of personality. They're really broad and basic traits that are argued to be relatively few in number. And so these were kind of like where this trait theory sort of started from. Now, when we look at the major theorists, we're going to talk about three major theorists. And I like to think of this, honestly, as a Goldilocks and the Three Bears sort of story. And so I'm going to explain what that means. So Raymond Cattell, he said that there were 16 personality factors. There were 16 basic traits that made up, these factors that made up personalities. And so he used a technique called factor analysis, and essentially what it is that he has tons and tons and tons of traits, and then he breaks them down, and it's a fancy analysis to essentially see which traits are more like others, and then they end up factoring in with each other, and then you can lump them together into categories. And so he found that when you put all these tons and tons of factors together, they broke up into 16 main factors. So he developed something called the 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire, or 16PF, and believed, okay, now this is what personality is made up of. Now, think of this like the Goldilocks and Three Bears story. So Goldilocks and the Three Bears, we have Goldilocks who breaks into some bear's house, and let's talk about the porridge situation. So she goes in and she wants to eat their porridge. Well, Papa Bear's porridge is too hot. Mama Bear's porridge is too cold, and Baby Bear's porridge is just right. So I like to think of the personality theories like this. Raymond Cattell's porridge is too much. It's too hot. People said 16 factors, way too many traits, way too many factors. So people said, no, I do not like the 16 factor theory because it's just too many. So Raymond Cattell really was one of those that they said, that's a great idea, but we don't believe that that's true. Now, Hans Eysenck came in and said, ooh, okay, so this idea is essentially that if 16 are too many, let's stick with 3, okay? And so in essence, what ended up happening was he said that there's a much simpler model. There are 3 source traits. We have extroversion and introversion, neuroticism and stability, and psychoticism, goodness gracious, psychoticism. And so essentially, if you direct your energy more inward, so this first one's all about energy. If you directed your energy more inward, then you're an introvert. If you directed it more outward, you're an extrovert. Neuroticism is how likely you are to become upset emotionally. So if you become very easily upset, you would be highly neurotic. And if you're very stable, okay, you're less neurotic and more stable. Psychoticism is essentially a person high in psychoticism would be very antisocial, very cold, hostile, and unconcerned about others. If you tested very low in psychoticism, then you're very caring and warm. And so he basically said, okay, you can actually combine these into 4 basic personality types using these 3, universal source traits. You could be introverted neurotic, you could be introverted stable, you could be extroverted neurotic, or extroverted stable. And in essence, the psychoticism part was an extra trait that was added on top of that. But there's 4 basic types of that. And he believed also that there were individual differences in personality because of biology. So he would say, for example, that a person who is very introverted might be so because in essence they do not like a lot of stimulation, and so their biology that makes up their attention and their threshold for having very loud things around them was very low. And so because a person didn't like to have a really loud environment, they might actually seek out quieter spaces. And so you might actually become introverted simply because your biology says that you want to be in a quieter place. And so he actually believed that these were due to biological differences. Whereas if you have a high threshold for noise and excitement and your nervous system can take that, essentially, was that you will more of an extrovert because of that. And so this is just kind of an idea of how his 4 basic personality types were associated. Now, here's the interesting thing. When we look at the whole, Goldilocks and 3 bears element, 16 was too many. That porridge is way too hot. Well, a lot of scientists said, well, 3 source traits, that is not enough. That porridge is too cold. And so they did not like Eysink's views because they thought that 3 source traits was certainly not enough. So then this is where McCrae and Costa come in. This is the porridge is just right. Okay, this is where we see, okay, this is Baby Bear's porridge. We like this. They have the 5-factor model. The 5-factor model is essentially the 5 basic personality dimensions. Okay, and so what this is essentially is what's referred to as the Big 5, and it's rated. These 5 basic characteristics are rated from low to high, and these are the 5 basic ones. Neuroticism. So do you rank high or low on neuroticism? Extroversion, do you rank high or low on extroversion? And of course, if you rank low on extroversion, then you would be considered an introvert. If you rated low on neuroticism, you'd be more stable. Openness to experience, rating on that. Agreeableness, okay, how agreeable are you? And then finally, conscientiousness, how kind are you to others? The interesting thing about the 5-factor model is that it's actually been tested in more than 50 cultures and is very stable across different cultures. So this is getting at universal 5 big factor characteristics of personality. Since we see this as being universal, it must be biologically adaptive, and we must find it must be a part of evolution if these factors are consistent across cultures. And we see that the majority of these traits seem to be pretty stable over time. The only one probably really is seeing a slight difference is neuroticism. People tend to be slightly less neurotic as they grow older. But overall, these traits seem to be pretty stable. And we also see that it's consistent over many different situations and over time. And we actually see some brain activity and brain structures related to some of these big, these 5 factors. And then when we look at these personality traits in general, we see that looking at behavioral genetics gives us this idea of, okay, what personality factors might actually be hereditary. And so we've found that twin studies show that openness to experience, conscientiousness and agreeableness, which are three of the five big factors, five big factors, are actually influenced by genetics to a lesser extent. So again, these twin studies showing that these three factors are not quite as influenced by genetics as the other two. We also find that one interesting thing to kind of test genetic relatedness is to test twins who grow up and leave home, or who are adopted by different people, and test what they're like so that they didn't grow up in the same place. But we find that personalities can diverge somewhat once twins grow up and leave home, which shows that environment and experience does actually does show a little difference there. So personality can be influenced by environment experience. Now, when we look at genetic influence, the extroversion and eroticism seem to be the two major of the big five factor traits that actually potentially are influenced by genetics. So finally, looking at this particular perspective and the strengths and weaknesses, of course, some of the strengths, yeah, we get it. People can be described by personality traits, by these, individual characteristics. And we know that they can be compared with that. But the problem is that it does not really explain human personality. It just kind of quantifies it. It categorizes it. It doesn't explain how or why those individual differences develop. And it doesn't address other important personality issues that we see, for example, in emotion and in conflict, and in some things that we see in a social cognitive perspective. So none of these personality theories stand alone by themselves are the absolute best perspective. A good perspective would be a blending of some of these particular theories. So the last thing we're going to talk about, I'm going to do a final video on how we assess personality, and then that will be the end to this personality lecture series.